I wasn't supposed to stop by my son-in-law's house that afternoon. I was just driving past, thinking about dinner, thinking about work, thinking about nothing in particular. Then I saw my wife's car. Her silver Lexus was parked right in front of his gate. The same car that should have been sitting in our garage. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. For a second, I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was helping our daughter. Maybe it was coincidence. After 25 years of marriage, you learn to talk yourself out of uncomfortable thoughts. But my gut didn't buy it. I pulled over quietly, cut the engine, and stepped out of my car. I didn't slam the door. I didn't announce myself. I just walked up to the side window, heart pounding, the way it does right before something irreversible happens. That's when I heard her voice. When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything. I froze. That wasn't frustration. That wasn't sarcasm. That was strategy. My wife of 25 years was sitting inside my son-in-law's house, calmly discussing my divorce like a business transaction. And my son-in-law, a lawyer, was laying out the plan with surgical precision. Filing dates, asset division, spousal support, documentation. They were laughing about how easy it would be, laughing about how trusting I was, laughing about how I had no idea they'd been tracking my finances for months. I stood there, invisible, listening to my life get dismantled in real time. Every late night I worked, every risk I took building my company, every dollar I earned with my own hands, reduced to bullet points in a legal strategy. I didn't burst in. I didn't confront them. I didn't shout or cry. I took out my phone and hit record. Because something strange happened in that moment. The pain didn't explode. It condensed. It turned cold. Clear. Focused. I realized something they hadn't considered. They thought I was naive because I trusted them. They thought kindness meant weakness. They thought I was just a tired old man who wouldn't see it coming. They were wrong. By the time I walked back to my car, I wasn't shaking anymore. I wasn't confused. I wasn't heartbroken. I was done being the man they planned to destroy. I drove home like nothing had happened. I cooked dinner. I answered my wife's text politely. I listened to her talk about her day as if she hadn't just laughed about stealing my life. She thought she was playing chess with a man who didn't know the rules. What she didn't know was that I had built an entire empire by thinking 10 moves ahead, and the game had just begun. Before anyone ever called me an old fool, before my marriage turned into a legal strategy session, I was just a man trying to build something that would last. I didn't inherit money. I didn't marry into it. I built everything from the ground up with my own hands. When I started my construction company 35 years ago, I owned exactly one pickup truck, a borrowed cement mixer, and a toolbox that rattled every time I hit a pothole. I worked 12, sometimes 16 hours a day. Weekends weren't for rest. They were for catching up. There were years when instant noodles and gas station coffee made up most of my diet because every spare dollar went back into the business. Margaret knew all of that. She met me when I was still fighting to stay afloat, when there was no guarantee I'd succeed. Back then, she admired my work ethic, or at least she said she did. For the first decade, every major decision I made revolved around responsibility. Payroll came before comfort. Equipment came before vacations. When the company finally stabilized, I didn't celebrate with luxury. I reinvested. I hired more people. I took on bigger contracts. Slowly, painfully, the company grew. By the time our daughter was born, I was already working 14-hour days consistently. I missed dinners. I missed birthdays. I missed school events. Not because I didn't care, but because every missed hour of work meant fewer opportunities for the future I was trying to secure for my family. Over the years, the sacrifices added up. I paid for private schools. I paid for college without loans. I covered living expenses, tuition, books, and housing. I never once asked for reimbursement or gratitude. That was my job as a father. When the company landed its first major municipal contract, worth 8 figures over several years, I felt pride, not in the money, but in what it represented: stability, security, proof that all those years of exhaustion had meant something. Margaret benefited from all of it. She never had to work unless she wanted to. She drove new cars. She traveled when she pleased. She decorated our home without asking what things cost. I handled the finances because that was my area of expertise. But I never restricted her spending. I trusted her. Trust was my biggest mistake. For 25 years, I believed we were a team, that every late night, every stressful negotiation, every physical ache from decades on construction sites was a shared investment in a shared life. I believed that loyalty was mutual. I believed that sacrifice was understood. I believed that love was real. While I was focused on building something solid and lasting, I didn't notice when gratitude quietly turned into expectation. I didn't see when appreciation transformed into entitlement. I was too busy making sure the machine kept running. By the time I realized something was wrong, the foundation I thought we shared had already been hollowed out, and I was the only one who hadn't noticed. The betrayal didn't start the day I heard their voices through the window. It started quietly, politely, almost invisibly. At first, it was small things I brushed off as part of a long marriage. Margaret began asking more questions about money. Not curious questions, calculated ones. She wanted exact numbers, valuations, timelines, what was liquid, what wasn't. I told myself it was normal. People think about security as they get older. That's what I said to myself. Then came the comparisons. Margaret would casually mention other couples we knew, men whose wives had newer cars, bigger houses, flashier vacations. She never said I wasn't doing enough. She didn't have to. The silence between her words did that work for her. She started criticizing decisions I made for decades without question. Why keep so much capital tied up in the company? Why not sell certain properties? Why not restructure things differently? Each suggestion sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they felt like pressure. I ignored the discomfort. Around that same time, she grew closer to our son-in-law. Too close. She admired his profession, his legal mind, his confidence. She'd ask him questions at family dinners, leaning forward, listening intently in ways she hadn't listened to me in years. I told myself I was imagining it. The entitlement crept in slowly. Margaret stopped saying thank you, stopped asking. She started assuming. Trips were expected. Purchases were automatic. If I hesitated, even briefly, her mood shifted. Not anger, disappointment, as if I'd failed some unspoken obligation. I worked harder to compensate. I thought if I provided more, things would settle, that the distance between us was temporary, that loyalty would resurface if I just stayed steady. Instead, the gap widened. She became secretive with her phone, took calls in other rooms, claimed they were charity meetings, social planning, favors for friends. I didn't check. I didn't pry. I trusted her. Trust made me blind. There were moments now that replay in my mind with cruel clarity. Conversations where she framed herself as trapped, sacrificed, underappreciated. Moments where she tested how far she could push without resistance. And every time I gave in, every time I smoothed things over, I taught her something dangerous, that I would always absorb the cost. By the time I sensed something was truly wrong, the dynamic had shifted completely. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was a resource, a problem to be managed, a future payout waiting to be unlocked. I just didn't know it yet. I stayed outside that window longer than any man should have to. Every sentence I heard stripped away another layer of the life I thought I had built. They weren't arguing. They weren't emotional. They were efficient, professional, calm. That was the worst part. My wife spoke about our marriage the way someone talks about an expired contract. 25 years reduced to strategy, timing, optics. She talked about patience, about playing the role, about how convincing it had been to pretend she cared about my long days and constant stress. When she laughed, it wasn't nervous or bitter. It was light, amused. That laugh broke something in me. My son-in-law's voice followed, steady and confident. He explained the law the way surgeons explain anatomy, where to cut, how deep, what would bleed the most. He talked about documentation they had already collected, bank statements, property values, business records. They had been preparing for months, while I was working late, while I was worrying about payroll, while I was thinking about retirement and how to make sure everyone was comfortable. They were planning my financial execution. At one point, my wife said something that still echoes in my head. He won't fight it. He hates conflict. Hell, you want to keep things peaceful. She was right about one thing. I did hate conflict. But she misunderstood why. I didn't avoid conflict because I was weak. I avoided it because I didn't need chaos to feel powerful. I built my life quietly, methodically, without spectacle. And now I was listening to the people closest to me mistake restraint for surrender. I felt no urge to confront them, no desire to storm inside and demand explanations. Anger would have given them control. Shock would have exposed me. So I did the only smart thing. I listened. I recorded everything. When I finally stepped away from the house, my hands were steady. My breathing was even. I wasn't grieving anymore. Grief assumes something can be saved. This couldn't. The marriage I believed in had never existed the way I thought it did. What I had loved was a performance, a role played well enough to keep me productive and compliant. By the time I reached my car, one truth was clear. I had been betrayed deliberately, strategically, without remorse. And betrayal like that doesn't deserve forgiveness. It deserves consequences. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind was finally clear. I sat alone in my home office, replaying the recording over and over. Each time, the emotions faded further, replaced by analysis, patterns, intent, motive. It was no longer my wife's voice I was hearing. It was evidence. For the first time in months, everything made sense. The sudden questions about asset structure, the interest in liquidation, the admiration for legal tactics, the quiet shift from partnership to positioning. None of it was random. It had all been preparation. And once I accepted that, the pain lost its power. I wasn't angry. Anger clouds judgment. I wasn't heartbroken. Heartbreak makes you reckless. I was awake. I opened my old contact list and scrolled until I found the name I trusted more than anyone when things mattered. My accountant. He'd been with me for over 20 years. He knew my books better than anyone alive. He knew what was visible, and more importantly, what wasn't. When I told him what I discovered, he didn't gasp. He didn't ask emotional questions. He simply went quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Good thing you found out now." That's when I knew I wasn't alone. Within 48 hours, we had reviewed everything, every account, every structure, every legal boundary, what could be protected, what needed to be isolated, what should never be touched until the right moment. He didn't judge. He didn't sympathize. He focused. Next came the bank. Not a call center, not customer service. I went directly to the people who had approved my largest loans, who knew my reputation, who had watched me build my business without shortcuts or scandals. I didn't explain my marriage. I explained risk. They understood immediately. Then I called a lawyer, not my son-in-law, not anyone connected to him, someone older, someone who had no interest in drama and no tolerance for manipulation. When I laid everything out, including the recording, he leaned back in his chair and nodded once. "They underestimated you," he said. "That's always the fatal mistake." By the end of that week, I had something I hadn't had in a long time: control. Not control over people, control over outcomes. My wife still smiled at dinner, still asked polite questions, still believed she was several moves ahead. She had no idea the board had shifted, and she had no idea the man she thought she was outsmarting had already stopped playing defense. I didn't confront her. That was the part she never understood. People like my wife expect explosions, accusations, emotional outbursts. They can twist and weaponize. Silence, on the other hand, makes them careless. So I stayed quiet. While she believed everything was proceeding according to plan, I was methodically locking doors she didn't even know existed. The first move was invisible: account access reviews, security audits, temporary holds justified as routine safeguards. Every step was legal, documented, clean. I wasn't hiding assets. I was protecting them. Money stopped flowing without drama. Her cards declined at lunch. Automatic payments stalled. Joint credit lines required verification. Nothing dramatic enough to cause alarm, just enough friction to disrupt her sense of entitlement. She called the bank. They told her it was procedural. She called me. I told her I'd look into it, and I did nothing. While she struggled to understand why convenience had suddenly disappeared, I was studying transaction histories. Patterns emerged quickly. Transfers I hadn't authorized, accounts I hadn't opened, small amounts at first, then larger ones. She hadn't just planned to leave, she had already started taking. That's when I expanded the trap. I documented everything: dates, amounts, destinations. I followed the money quietly, letting her believe she was still unseen. Her confidence made her sloppy. Confidence always does. Meanwhile, my son-in-law kept smiling at family dinners, offering legal insights, speaking as if the outcome was inevitable. He believed knowledge of the law made him untouchable. It didn't. Every time he spoke, he revealed more about how he thought, what angles he trusted, which assumptions he relied on. He never once considered that I might already be 10 steps ahead. The most important part of the trap was restraint. I didn't correct her lies. I didn't challenge her mood swings. I didn't ask questions that would tip my hand. I became predictable again. Calm. Passive. Exactly what she expected. She mistook silence for surrender. By the time she realized something was wrong, every meaningful lever was already out of her reach. And all I had done was let her keep talking. Confidence is a dangerous thing when it's unearned. As the days passed, my wife grew bolder, not cautious, not reflective, bold. She believed momentum was on her side, that whatever inconvenience she was experiencing was temporary, that lawyers and paperwork would eventually force me back into line. She started acting like a woman already half free. She complained openly about me to friends, about how controlling I'd become, about how she felt trapped after giving her whole life to a marriage. The irony would have been impressive if it hadn't been so calculated. She framed herself as the victim with remarkable skill. Meanwhile, my son-in-law became insufferable. At family gatherings, he spoke with smug certainty, made casual remarks about how divorce law favored fairness, about how long marriages came with expectations, about how courts didn't look kindly on men who tried to hoard wealth. He never looked at me directly when he said these things. He didn't need to. He believed the outcome was guaranteed. They had already spent the money in their minds, planned the lifestyle, divided the future, entitled to it simply because they wanted it. That entitlement was their blind spot. They didn't understand how deeply I valued responsibility, how carefully I documented everything, how little patience I had for people who mistook manipulation for intelligence. My wife began talking about her share without embarrassment, about what she deserved after decades of sacrifice. She spoke as if the marriage had been a transaction and she was simply collecting what was owed. She forgot one thing. Transactions require consent. As for my son-in-law, he pushed harder. He sent subtle legal threats through casual conversation, suggested timelines, implied consequences if I didn't cooperate. He thought pressure would scare me. Instead, it confirmed my assessment. He had no leverage left. He just didn't know it yet. They were celebrating too early, counting victories that hadn't been earned, acting as if the game was already over. That kind of arrogance doesn't just invite downfall, it accelerates it. The day everything broke open didn't start with shouting or confrontation. It started with paperwork. My wife thought she was walking into a routine legal meeting, a preliminary step, a formality before the real fight began. She dressed carefully that morning, the way she always did when she wanted to look composed and reasonable. She believed optics still mattered. My son-in-law was confident, too confident. He arrived early, briefcase in hand, wearing the expression of a man who thought he was about to demonstrate superiority. He nodded at me like we were colleagues, not adversaries. I said nothing. When everyone was seated, the attorney I had hired calmly placed a folder on the table. Thick, organized, labeled. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He simply began. He explained that before any discussion of asset division, there were matters that needed clarification. Documentation discrepancies, unauthorized transfers, conflicts of interest. My wife frowned for the first time. My son-in-law leaned forward, suddenly alert. Then my attorney played the recording. The room changed immediately. My wife's voice filled the space, casual, cruel, mocking, discussing my life as if it were already over, discussing money as if it were already hers. My son-in-law's legal analysis followed, precise and damning. Timelines, strategy, exploitation. There was no denying it. No room to reinterpret. When the recording stopped, silence pressed down hard. My wife's face drained of color. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. For the first time since I had known her, she had no script. My son-in-law tried to recover. He attempted to speak, to explain context, to suggest misinterpretation. He was interrupted, not by me, by my attorney. He calmly pointed out that the individual advising my wife had a direct personal interest in the outcome, that legal ethics had been violated, that financial misconduct was already documented. My son-in-law sat back slowly. The confidence was gone. My wife looked at me then, really looked at me. Not with anger, not with manipulation, with fear. She finally understood what silence had meant. This wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was exposure. Once the truth was exposed, everything unraveled faster than I expected. My wife tried to recover first. She cried, apologized, claimed she had been confused, misled, overwhelmed. She said she never meant for things to go that far, that the conversation had been taken out of context. Context didn't matter anymore. The recording wasn't emotional. It wasn't ambiguous. It was calculated. Every word had been chosen carefully. There was no room to reinterpret intent. When that failed, she turned defensive. She accused me of spying, of violating her privacy, of setting traps. It was the reflex of someone who had never been held accountable and didn't know how to stand without a script. My son-in-law collapsed differently. His voice lost its authority. His arguments lost their structure. He shifted from confidence to aggression, from aggression to desperation. He threatened lawsuits. He warned of consequences. He spoke quickly, trying to regain control through volume. No one listened. Conflicts of interest were documented. Financial misconduct was already under review. His role shifted from strategist to liability in a matter of minutes. The moment that stayed with me most was the silence that followed. No insults, no shouting, just the quiet realization that their plan had failed completely. Friends disappeared. Support evaporated. The narrative my wife had been spreading collapsed under its own weight once facts entered the conversation. People who had nodded sympathetically began avoiding her calls. Reputations don't shatter loudly. They erode. As for me, I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice even once. I simply answered questions honestly and provided documentation when asked. That was enough. By the end of it, my wife was alone. Not because I isolated her, but because manipulation doesn't survive daylight. My son-in-law lost more than the case. His credibility followed him out the door. And I learned something important. You don't need revenge when the truth is this thorough. When everything was over, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not empty, honest. The house was quieter without her presence, but it was also lighter. No tension humming under the surface, no performances, no careful words chosen to avoid conflict. Just space. Space to breathe. Space to think. For the first time in decades, my life belonged entirely to me again. The business stabilized quickly once the distractions were gone. Clients respected consistency, and my reputation had always been built on reliability, not appearances. Contracts continued. Projects moved forward. The machine I had built with discipline and patience did what it always did. It worked. My daughter came around, slowly, carefully. She didn't rush forgiveness or loyalty. She asked questions. She listened. She chose truth over comfort. And that mattered more to me than blind support ever could. We rebuilt something real, not a fantasy of family unity, but an honest relationship grounded in boundaries and accountability. As for my wife, reality arrived quietly and stayed. No dramatic downfall, no public spectacle, just the slow understanding that entitlement doesn't translate into security, that manipulation has an expiration date, that comfort without contribution eventually runs out. I didn't interfere. I didn't punish. I simply stepped aside and let the consequences land where they belonged. That was enough. People ask me now if I regret not fighting sooner, if I regret trusting too much, if I regret being kind. I don't. Kindness wasn't the mistake. Kindness without boundaries was. I learned that loyalty must be mutual, that respect can't be demanded, and that protecting what you build is not cruelty, it's responsibility. I live quietly now, on my terms, with fewer people, but more peace, with less noise, but more clarity. And if there's one thing I know for certain, it's this. When someone mistakes your patience for weakness, the lesson they learn will be far more painful than anything you could ever say.